Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, welcome, welcome. Oh my, look at what we have here. It's my 1961 Apache cab sitting on the Frankenstein suspension from this video. There's a whole comedy of parts here. Stuff I planned, stuff that showed up, and stuff that freakishly worked despite my best efforts. I want it to ride low, I want it cheap, and I want to use OEM parts as much as possible. First off, we got to figure out what we're doing with the front suspension. A set of 88 to 98 Chevy truck drop spindles fell into my lap for cheap, but the geometry of these is different than the 73 to 87 suspension I installed, and now you got to make it fit. 73 to 87 half-ton ball joints don't fit the 88 to 98 spindles, so those have to be changed. I pressed them out and then used a 3-inch hole saw to cut out the existing mounting hole out, but offset 1/2 inch so new mounting rings can be installed and the change in camber can be corrected. Sorry about the camera location, I clearly wasn't thinking about you at the time. Because I'm considering doing an air ride suspension, the bushings need to be changed to polyurethane. Rubber bushings are glued and they twist as the suspension moves up and down, which is fine, but if the air ride is going to be moving a lot, because dude, that's cool, poly bushings slide instead of twist, making it a much more forgiving pivot. I've done bushings in many vehicles and it's never fun. On this one, I'm using a drill bit to drill its way into the bushing and hopefully walk around the sleeves, thus cutting the rubber free so it can pop right out. The inner sleeves should be a loose fit around the shaft, but they required some persuasion to come off. The outer sleeves need locking tabs bent back and then they can be air chiseled out. And now sandblasting. This is really sped up because, oh my gosh, is it ever boring. I bought this cabinet at Princess Auto 15 years ago for a screaming deal, and I freaking love it. I had it stored at the school for a while because my air compressor at the time couldn't run it. I even let kids use it until they blasted the glass completely opaque. And then I locked it away from the little cherubs, because ain't no task so simple that a kid can't screw it up. This took forever. Oh my gosh. I think it was an hour per control arm to blast. It's a decent cabinet, and there's a link in the description below to my webpage where I outline some modifications to the unit to make it so much better, including the addition of 4 100-watt LED lights, better airflow, and a hookah pot of vacuous goodness to keep the dust inside to a minimum. Since I'm making some changes to the suspension, it's a good idea to have freshly blasted clean metal on which to weld. I machined new ball joint rings on the lathe, set to the proper interference fit required from the Machinist's Handbook. If you can't sleep at night, that's the book for you, followed by books on aerodynamics. Oh man. If you're watching this and thinking, wait a minute, Mr. Wellwood, isn't a lacquer thinner soaked paper kind of flammable? You'd be right. In fact, if you watch closely, I'm trying to hide the burned holes from your view. Funny story, when I started teaching mechanics, I used wood shavings from the wood shop to soak up oil spills. Worked awesome. Wood shop kept making the shavings, I was set for life. The fire marshal didn't like that. Apparently oil-soaked wood chips are flammable. Who knew? Now I gotta use floor dry. So boring. I needed to alter the forward leg of the control arm closer to the bushing to clear a Mustang steering rack. To keep the arm from changing shape much, I welded a tube brace to the backside. Then a couple of strategically placed cuts and I can reshape the arm. I like to use TIG welding for things that are structural. I'm also not a ticketed welder, so take this with a grain of salt. Welding both sides, making sure there's no voids. This is my first time using a clear Pyrex cup and gas lens. I highly recommend it. Everything is so much more visible. Then we move on to the upper arm. Same poo, just a different shovel. Drill out the rubber bushings, break a couple drill bits, remove the mounting shaft, remove the inner sleeves from the mounting shaft, hammer out the steel sleeves, grind off the ball joints, hammer out what's left of the ball joints, remove the ball joints, repeat for the other side, and then, of course, sandblast. Subscribe and leave a comment below if you're having a blast with sand. I think I put fresh sand in for these, and it's not actually sand. I think it's glass. I don't know. It was on sale. But I'm wearing a mask because it really isn't good for you, whatever it is. At the beginning of this video, you may have noticed I measured a bunch of angles on the ball joints on both arms. Because I need to ride low and possibly even lay frame, I need to alter the upper ball joint mounting angle so the joint doesn't lock up at full drop. A ball joint is much like your hip. If you've ever accidentally done the split so violently that your hip pops out of the socket, you're in for a bad day. If that hip were to pop so badly that your leg detaches and passes you at a high rate of speed and you're going, that looks like my leg, you know that day is going to get a whole lot worse. I don't want the upper ball joint to have to move more than it can. It can break or pop out, and carnage ensues. Carnage. I pie cut the arms about 10 degrees, and it worked perfect. Both arms were welded up on both sides, taking time to sandblast the back sides prior to welding. The metal joints were smoothed and shaped, and then cleaned up to look just darling. You'll notice the lacquer-soaked paper with holes in it is gone. I eventually glued in. But I tell you, that wee tuna can that I'm using to hold stuff smells pretty foul when a good amount of welding heat is applied to it. At this point, I needed to figure out how to mount the steering rack. There are many different kits to put rack and pinion on a C10, and if they can do it, I can do it. I just got to figure out how. Having said that, I couldn't figure out how to use the driver's side mounting boss with the packaging of everything else. I decided to fabricate some sort of clamp, which meant cutting off the boss. I started off with a hacksaw, then my corded sawzall. A good tip, use WD-40 to keep the cutter from gumming up with aluminum as you go. Then I used a flap disc on an angle grinder to make fine adjustments to the shape. The rack width and placement is really critical. If you draw a line through the pivots of each control arm, where they intersect off to the left in this picture is called the instant center. That's the pivot point around which the wheel actually moves as it travels up and down. A line from the instant center back to the outer tie rod on the spindle is where the steering rack inner tie rod needs to fall, usually in plane with the inner pivots of the control arm. The upper arm shaft is also angled back as viewed from the side to provide anti-dive under braking, which provides another instant center that the wheels pivot around, resulting in calculations that make my head explode. So while you can design it on a computer to 4 decimal places, by the time you actually have it cut out and welded back together, it's probably going to be about as good as the 2-bit hacks that put this truck together on a Monday morning in 1961 after the weekend bender to end all benders. If the rack width and placement do not match the movement of the wheel in bump and droop, the truck will steer itself when it hits a bump. This is called bump steer, and it can be disastrous. So I calculated, measured, cut, and placed the rack where I thought it should go, then made an adjustable positioning jig so I could run the suspension up and down and position the rack to minimize any toe change. This, of course, meant painting and finishing the control arms, installing the bushings and the ball joints. I sprayed 2 coats of epoxy primer and 2 coats of Eastwood chassis black. Bushing sleeves were pressed in, using threaded spacers on the lower arms to stop the ends of the arms from collapsing. Bushings were Summit Racing brand, but are clearly made by Energy Suspension. They send you almost enough of their fancy grease to do the job. Almost enough. Luckily, I had a wee tub from a previous vehicle, which was perfect. Poly bushings do have a tendency to squeak. Lots of tricks out there to reduce it. I just turned the stereo up louder. Lower ball joints are pressed in with no drama, and the upper arms were installed with the nuts above the arm so that they don't interfere with the rubber boot. Spindles were installed just finger tight, and I'm using 88 to 98 outer tie rod ends. 18-inch Jeep Grand Cherokee wheels fit perfectly, and the wheels clear the control arms perfectly. I got lucky. Once it's all together, we can place the rack and check for toe movement. Ideally, you want 0 toe change, but life isn't like that. So if you have to fail with toe out on bump. But keep it as minimal a toe change as you can, like less than 1/32 of an inch if possible. Now, I recognize that this isn't going to be a Formula 1 half-ton pickup. What I did get down to was 0 toe change in a full 5 inches of bump travel, but it got a little drunk in droop, gaining an 1/8 inch of toe in every inch of droop. Will this be death on the road? Subscribe so you can find out on the 61's maiden voyage. Watch the inaugural adventure of impending doom. Once I got its placement reasonably acceptable, I made the mounts for it. I machined a 3/4 inch post for the passenger side mount, welded to a 3/16 chunk of plate, tack welded it in the cross member where I figured it should go, and then I started making the brackets using Schedule 40 pipe. I didn't have the right diameter, so I had to cut 2 rings and then split them in half and kind of make them into the size I needed it to be. It's just metal shaping. I did use a piece of welding rod and bent it to the right shape that I wanted it to be, and then cut the metal to try and match that. A little bit of hacksawing, hammering, tomfoolery, and then I ended up with rings that would wrap around the driver's side of the rack and pinion, insulated with a bit of rubber heater hose, I guess. And then I used 3/8 coupling nuts to act as the fasteners with some Allen head screws to hold the whole thing together. So I joined the pipe together, welded the coupling nut on both sides, and then hacksawed through the coupling nut, and then drilled through one half so that the bolt would slide nicely and then thread into the other. This worked pretty good. Once you weld it though, everything shrinks, so you got to chase the threads with a tap and die. Then, once it's all clamped onto the rack, position it, check the placement, and then you got to figure out where the brackets have to be. Cardboard is always my friend in figuring out how the brackets should go, and cut and place and look and snip and trim, and then always think, if I ever have to take this apart, can I take this apart? And can I get in there? Can I get a wrench in there? That's all kind of important. So brackets were cut out of 3/16, tacked into place, checked to make sure they work, and then fully welded to hold it in place. And then I'm trying to think of if this vehicle's in a collision or hits a curb, how can I reduce the chance of things breaking? So there's a couple things you got to keep in mind when you build stuff: serviceability, survivability in day-to-day stuff, and what about if you're in a collision? You never want to be in a collision, but you want to plan for that. Had to close up some of the holes in the cross member with plate, so that's just cut to fit. Lots of welding, lots of grinding, trimming and smoothing it up, because if it looks like booger, people aren't going to want to be happy with that. Now, I'm not building a show truck, I just want it to be nice. One of the cool things about the Chevy truck tie rod ends is they use 11/16 by 18. The challenge of that is 11/16 normally is 16 threads per inch, but for whatever drunken reason, GM decided to use 11/16 18. Speedway Motors has that tap available. Nobody locally did. Was also able to get a hold of two jam nuts, and it cost about $90 Canadian for the tap and two nuts shipped to Canada, so I could make the rack and pinion adapter sleeves to connect the Fox Body Mustang inner tie rods to the 88 to 98 outer tie rods. The 61 didn't come with a front sway bar, and honestly, if you want a vehicle to handle anything better than a dish rag, you're going to want sway bars. So this is just a square body sway bar, drilled and attached to the frame rails, and just connects right up to the control arms. These are the ones that came on my Suburban front suspension. The back is a 9-inch Ford rear end from an 80s pickup, which is 5 on 5.5-inch bolt circle, and I need 5 on 5. I could get the axle shafts re-drilled, but it would cost me about $300 Canadian per axle to do it. For $150 US per axle, I got new shafts and new bearings, new seals, pressed all into place, and then now the back bolt pattern matches the front bolt pattern, and I'm a happy camper. And 5 on 5 is Jeep Grand Cherokee. Also converting to rear disc brakes using the rotors from a 94 to 96 Impala and calipers from a 93 to 97 F-body. Shocks arrive from Rock Auto, yay! The front shocks are 73 to 87 fronts and are mounted using the 61's mount in such a way that at full bump with no bump stops, the shocks will be fully compressed. The rear shocks are 63 to 72 rears, using the 61's original mount, again located to be fully compressed when the suspension is fully compressed, and I tried to fit them as vertically as I could. Be sure to subscribe and ring the silly little bell to be alerted for the next video, Drivetrain Plumbing and You. Thanks for watching.